Hey, fellow DIYers. My dry creek bed is 1 year old this month in June 2024. And I got an awful lot of good information and advice off of YouTube as well as researching online before I made my dry creek bed. So I thought I would return the favor here and do a video of how mine turned out and any tips that I have for doing one, and as well as lessons learned now that I have had this dry creek bed in for a year. It's not completely done yet because I dug it by hand, a shovel at a time, along with the help of a wheelbarrow and a mini chainsaw. But anyway, so tips to start off with. The first thing that I would say is make sure you know where your utility lines are and call Julie, as they say, if you can, to find out where they are. The next thing that I would definitely say is check with your town to find out if there's a building permit required for putting in a dry creek bed. Some towns have them, some towns do not, but you definitely want to make sure that if you're required to permit for a dry creek bed that you do it, because I guess it should go without saying that once you have your stone into your dry creek bed, it's going to take an awful lot of effort to make any changes. And you certainly don't want to get to a point where you decide to sell your home, and because you have something that's not permitted, they say you got to move it or got to get rid of it. My dry creek bed, I think it has about 7,000 pounds worth of stone in it. So I did all of that. I called Julie. I had my property flagged, even though I was pretty sure I knew where the utility lines were. And then I did a lot of careful research to make sure that I didn't require a building permit. And then, of course, the other thing is, even if you know where your utility lines are, even if you're not required to get a permit, make sure that you're being courteous to your neighbors. Because most people make a dry creek bed because they're trying to solve a drainage problem and, do it in a way that looks nice. And that was certainly the case for me. But, you don't want to make a dry creek bed and solve a problem for yourself and create a problem for a neighbor. And in my case, I had everything pretty well planned out. And when I started to test my dry creek bed, the exit point down here, which is where you see that little boy looking down like he's about to play in the water or play in the creek or whatever, that just exited out to right before where this fence was. My neighbor's property is on the other side of that. And what I quickly found out in that testing is that I wasn't going to get away with just having an exit tube to basically nowhere. So what I had to do to alter my plans was connect that exit point to a tube that goes all the way along the property line, way over to that far right-hand corner, then eventually exits right by the common sewer entrance for where the four properties meet. So they say good fences make good neighbors, but so does good planning, right? Because you don't want to cause a flood in someone else's yard. And so that comes to lessons learned, I guess. And one of the things that I would say is you're going to run into things when you do your dry creek bed where no matter how well you've planned, you're going to have to make adjustments. So when it came to the grading, after I had my dry creek bed in for about 9 months, 10 months or whatever, I noticed in the spring that this particular area right here sank quite a bit. I don't know why. I don't know if it was the weight of the stone or whatever, but it threw off all the careful grading that I had done, and water during rainstorms was pooling in here and not exiting down the way I had hoped and planned. So I had a couple of options: take all of this stone out, regrade again, but then I thought, well, it might just sink again more than I expected. So instead of regrading or kind of starting over in this area, what I did was I just did some extensions to the gutters and where this sump pump exits out. And it's kind of hard to see, but if you look real closely and if I zoom in, you can see my gutter extensions. They're kind of hidden here under the rock. They're the very wide, thin, black, they're almost flat-like. You can get them at Home Depot or any home improvement store. But what it does is it extended the drainage of these pipes out to where it could get to the area where the grade was still very much intact, and just move the exit point farther away from the house. So it gets to this point where the grade is still good, and then the water during particularly heavy rainstorms, it just slowly meanders down through the rock all the way down to the exit pipe that I showed you earlier. So that was one thing, unexpected, unplanned that I had to take care of. Another one, while I was digging the swale or the ditch or whatever you want to call it for this dry creek bed, is I ran into some significant roots, some pretty significant tree roots, and I thought to myself, well, I really don't want to do damage to the trees or harm to the trees, so what do? Do I just take a gamble and do I cut them? Or what do I do? So I spent an awful lot of time making it so that these tree roots right here, you can see one to the right and one to the left, I just kept them. But it took some extra work as far as regrading and getting all of the lining and all of the landscape fabric tucked underneath those roots. So speaking of lining and speaking of landscape fabric, let's go on to some lessons I've learned about having a dry creek bed. You would think with all this stone and the lining that I put down underneath, on top of which was then landscape fabric, and then on top of which is all this decorative stone, you would think with all that you would never see a weed. And what I've quickly learned is that a dry creek bed doesn't require a lot of maintenance, but it does require some upkeep. You are going to see some weeds, and depending on the design that you want, that you went with, and how you want it to look, both now and into the future, you need to do some maintenance on it, possibly. So for me, I walk this dry creek bed fairly regularly, and if I see any little weeds starting to pop out, I pull them then. I don't let them get bigger. I don't let them get woodiest. I don't let them turn into treelets. And then along those same lines, something else I have noticed is that it's a collection bed for twigs and leaves, especially in the fall. So something else I do on a regular basis is walk down this thing with a leaf blower, especially when I know the weather has been drier. I'll walk down this thing, try to get all the twigs out that I can, try to blow all the leaves out that I can, and hopefully while I'm doing that, it's blowing some dust and dirt out as well. Because no matter what you do, you are going to have some sediment that comes down from your roof or your maybe your sump pump exit, if you've done that, which is something that I've done here. And you just want to try to keep as much sediment and dirt and grime blown out of the dry creek bed as possible, because otherwise your dry creek bed is going to become just a muddy ditch over time. Another thing that I have also learned when it comes to a dry creek bed is you'll like it, your wife will like it, and so will nature. So I find that squirrels and chipmunks and rabbits are around my dry creek bed all the time. It's not that big of an issue within the stones itself, but when it comes to how I edged it with the mulch, they definitely like to dig in here. They like to burrow, they like to bury things, especially for the winter. They dig them back out. So I'm sure that as time goes on, they're going to be poking more and more holes into all that landscape fabric that I so carefully put down underneath where this mulch is. Something else that that I didn't think about as I designed my dry creek bed is this mulch. I knew I was going to line my dry creek bed with mulch, but what I really didn't stop to think about ahead of time is how am I going to keep that mulch from going into the dry creek bed, because you certainly don't want that. So you can probably see here what I've done is I lined the dry creek bed with thick oak branches, and then I'm holding those thick oak branches in place with medium-sized decorative stone. So those oak branches are basically holding back the mulch. And when I first did this last year, I wasn't altogether certain this was even going to work. But on the first heavy downpour, I noticed it did a surprisingly effective job of keeping the mulch from just washing into the dry creek bed. I would still say though, if you're going to mulch around your dry creek bed, try to do it at a time where you know you are not going to have torrential rains coming soon, because you want that mulch to kind of settle in, pack down, stick together, so that when you do have your first torrential rain, it doesn't just wash over any border that you might have, whether it be, landscape bordering or, like what I've done with oak branches. You want to make sure that doesn't get in the dry creek bed, because that would be a real pain in the neck to get out. On an unrelated note, you might notice this little footbridge I have here. I did get this off of Amazon, and you may have noticed that I walked over it. And there are a lot of comments on these type of kit bridges about how strong are they, can you walk over it? And mine you definitely can, but I did a lot of reinforcement to mine. I can't really flip this thing over, but if you were to go onto Amazon and you would look for this particular garden bridge or whatever, you would probably recognize my review by the pictures that I took in the dry creek bed. And on there you could see how heavily I reinforced the underside of my my bridge so that I can walk over it. And that's really important to me, because part of the grand scheme or idea of this bridge is to be able to get to this shed that I just put in and also permitted for this year. And that's where my lawnmower is, my power washer, and other things. So this bridge needed to be not only attractive, but it needed to be functional as well. So I walk across this bridge all the time, and I can tell you that it's plenty strong enough with my reinforcements to support 250 pounds, 300 pounds. I'll bet it would easily support 400 pounds with all the reinforcements that I've done. So that is my dry creek bed, and I love it. It has definitely solved the drainage problem that I set out to solve, and I'll just follow this dry creek bed all the way back up to where it begins, right at the corner of the house, to kind of talk about at the end the boring stuff, and also kind of show you an area that's really not quite done yet. So these are ugly and they need to be covered up with flat flagstone. That's my plan. But that right there, that is my sump pump ejection. And that right there is the main gutter to the back of the house, which faces the west-northwest side. So all that goes to say is that this corner of the house has the most moisture. And this was always a problem. Whenever there was even moderate rain, this area of the yard would just become an absolute bog for days on end. Not only was this area of the yard a bog and mushy and squishy, but the sump pump would run and run and run for days. Like every 5 minutes you would hear it kick off. And I believe what was happening was originally this sump pump would go down into the yard because it would sink into a hole not far from the house. And I think what they had done when they built the house is put in some sort of a drainage field underneath where the dry creek bed now is. And I think that drainage field just stopped working. And I think what would happen was the sump up would try to get the water away from the house. It was supposed to go into the drainage field, but then it would just keep coming back to the house and would go around and round and round in a circle until eventually enough would just seep into the ground. So by taking by taking the sump pump and ejecting it instead out into the dry creek bed, it exits around here, and the same thing with the main gutter, with it exiting right around the same area. Now the problem is solved. The water just kind of, builds up in here. It slowly trickles down all the way underneath the bridge and, eventually to that pipe or that exit point, which then goes into some corrugated pipe and goes all the way across the yard to the main gutter. So anyway, that is my dry creek bed, and I'm not saying that this is absolutely the only way to do it. It's an example of one, and as sometimes I look online, especially on YouTube, at some of the absolute artistic masterworks people have done in making their dry creek beds, and think to myself, oh, okay, mine really isn't that good. But in any case, it's very, very effective. I'm very, very happy I finally did it. It took me several years to get around to doing it because of one last bit of advice or tip that I will give you about doing a dry creek bed, depending on where you live. I am in northern Illinois, and like many places around the states, the soil around here is very, very clay rich. So I started this dry creek bed last spring when the ground was just warming up and it was moist and it was fairly easy to get a shovel through. If you live in the same area or someplace that has a lot of clay in the soil, if you wait till the ground starts to firm up and harden, like maybe summer, unless you have an excavator or a crew of people with a bunch of shovels who are willing to help you, heaven help you trying to dig through the ground. So that is something else to consider, I think, the time of year you are going to decide to try to make your dry creek bed. There is absolutely no way I could have done this any later than spring on any given year, especially since I did it alone. It was a one-person job, no excavator, just a shovel, and what else? Maybe a small power handsaw to cut some of these logs and whatnot, and a wheelbarrow to haul all of this stone from the front yard, from deliveries and whatnot, or from pickups that I did to the backyard. So all told, I think to get most of it done, it took me the better part of 9 weeks last spring, the spring of 2023. So in any case, I hope this is of help to someone out there. And again, look around at a lot of videos of dry creek beds, not only from DIYers, but professional contractors as well, because you want to get it right. You want it to be effective, and you certainly don't want to have to move it once you have it in. So thanks very much for watching. Take care.